He thought he had picked up a piece of scrap metal, but inside the rusty container was something that would change his life forever. No one expected it to have been hidden in the landfill for decades. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching this video. Michael Harris had always felt that his life was a machine that had been running for too long on worn-out parts. Every morning began the same way, with the shrill buzz of his alarm clock dragging him from shallow sleep into a world that never seemed to change. He rose slowly from the creaking mattress, his body heavy from years of physical work. His small apartment smelled faintly of old cooking oil and dampness, a scent that clung stubbornly to the walls. His wife, Rachel, rarely spoke in the mornings anymore. She would prepare her coffee in silence, pour some into a travel mug, and leave for her job without so much as a glance in his direction. Their son, James, was usually still asleep, sprawled across his bed with his phone lying face down on the nightstand, earbuds still tangled around his neck. Michael would sit at the edge of his own bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the worn carpet while gathering the strength to move. His hands bore the roughness of endless shifts, palms covered in calluses, knuckles dark and scarred. The warehouse had stolen most of his energy years ago, and yet he kept showing up because there was no other choice. Bills stacked themselves on the counter no matter how hard he worked. Rent climbed, groceries cost more, and debt hung around his neck like an iron chain. At the metals yard where he spent most of his waking hours, life was just as unforgiving. The air was filled with the shriek of saws and the pounding of hammers, sparks flying from grinders as men cut through the steel. The smell of burning metal clung to his clothes, and no matter how many times he washed his hands, the gray dust of the yard never truly disappeared. The boss never bothered to learn his name, barking orders with a voice that cracked like a whip, as if every man under his command was interchangeable. Michael was simply another body, a tool to haul, cut, and sweat until the day ended. His colleagues joked among themselves, laughed at small victories, cursed at their bad luck. But he remained quiet. He carried himself through each shift with the weariness of someone who had long ago stopped expecting life to offer him anything but survival. At home, his weariness became visible in the eyes of his family. Rachel's patience had eroded over the years. She had once believed in him, believed that he could build them a better life. But disappointment had grown like cracks in a foundation until there was nothing left to hold up. She looked at him with cool detachment, as though he were already a stranger. James had started pulling away too. At 15, the boy had learned shame, and Michael could see it in the way his son avoided bringing friends home, embarrassed by the peeling paint on the walls and the worn secondhand furniture. Sometimes James stared at him with quiet resentment, as if silently asking why he had to be born into a life so small and narrow. The day the container arrived began like any other, with the clang of trucks pulling into the yard, heavy chains rattling as they dragged broken machinery, scrap cars, and twisted beams. Michael was stacking old pipes when he noticed the truck backing in with something unusual chained to its bed. At first glance, it was just another rusted mass of metal, but when it was dropped onto the ground with a groan, everyone turned their heads. It was a shipping container, long and rectangular, its surface blistered with rust, paint flaking away like dry skin. The hinges sagged, and its doors looked ready to collapse. The men laughed at the sight of it. Someone shouted that it looked like a coffin for giants. Another said it belonged on the far end of the yard where useless junk went to die. No one wanted to touch it. The metal seemed too far gone to be worth the effort, and in a yard where profit depended on how much steel could be salvaged, wasting hours on something like that was foolish. But Michael lingered. He studied it longer than he should have, squinting at the locks that still clung to the doors. They were different from the ones he was used to seeing. Thick, heavy mechanisms, corroded with time but unmistakably built for more than simple security. They had the feel of something military, not civilian. The longer he stared, the stronger a curious unease grew in him. While the others mocked, Michael stepped forward and asked if he could claim it. The boss, too busy shouting at another man to care, waved his hand without even looking. Michael's co-workers shook their heads, muttering about wasted time, but he didn't care. For years he had done nothing but scrape by, bending beneath the weight of necessity. Something inside him stirred as he stood before the container. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps desperation, But he felt drawn to it, as if life itself had finally whispered an invitation. Dragging it to the side of the yard was no small task. He worked alone, straining as the container groaned across the gravel. Sweat soaked his shirt, muscles burning with the effort, but he did not stop. The others returned to their tasks, shaking their heads at his stubbornness. By the time he managed to wedge it into a quiet corner of the yard where he could work undisturbed, the sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the cluttered ground. When he finally stood back, chest heaving, he took a long moment to study it again. Up close, the container was even more unusual. The outer shell looked decrepit, but when he knocked his knuckles against the side, the sound was solid, too solid for something that should have been hollow. The resonance was strange, muted, as if another wall existed behind the one he struck. He frowned, running his hands across the corroded surface, and felt a thrill of anticipation curl low in his stomach. That night, back in his apartment, Rachel barely looked at him. Dinner was cold by the time he arrived, and James had already retreated to his room. Michael sat at the kitchen table, poking at the food with his fork, lost in thought. He could not stop seeing the container in his mind, its rusted skin, its heavy locks, the way it seemed to breathe silence even among the chaos of the yard. He thought about the laughter of his coworkers, how quickly they had dismissed it as worthless. But he had felt something different, not hope exactly, but possibility, faint as the flicker of a candle in darkness. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Rachel slept with her back turned to him. The ceiling above him was cracked and stained with old water damage, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Yet his mind was far away, back in the yard, circling the container over and over, wondering what lay behind its corroded walls. By the time the alarm buzzed the next morning, he had already decided. He would open it, no matter how long it took. For once in his life, he would not turn away. He would not surrender to despair or routine. The container was his now, and though he could not explain why, he knew that what waited inside would change everything. He rose from bed with a heaviness in his chest but a new resolve in his step. As he left the apartment, Rachel asked nothing, and James didn't even stir. Out in the dim light of dawn, he walked toward the yard with a single thought pounding in his mind. The container waited, and Michael Harris was ready to face it. The next day unfolded with a weight that pressed on Michael's chest from the moment he woke. His body ached from the strain of dragging the container across the yard, but he ignored the soreness in his arms and back. A sense of urgency kept his mind restless, his thoughts circling back to the same image, the massive iron shell squatting in the corner of the junkyard like a silent sentinel. It was all he could think about as he moved through the motions of his morning. He ate little, avoided Rachel's gaze, and left the apartment with the same heaviness that had long ago become habit. Yet unlike every other morning, he was carrying with him not just fatigue, but a gnawing curiosity that bordered on obsession. The junkyard looked the same as it always did, a landscape of twisted beams, piles of rusted cars, and mountains of discarded metal catching the pale light of morning. The clang of hammers echoed, sparks leapt from cutting torches, and voices shouted over the noise of machinery. But Michael's eyes ignored it all. His steps took him straight to the corner where the container waited. Its rusted skin looked no different than it had the day before, but now that it belonged to him, it seemed to hum with a presence, as though it knew he had returned. He ran his hands across its flaking surface, tracing the deep grooves where rust had eaten into the steel. To the others, it was nothing more than useless scrap, but Michael felt otherwise. There was something deliberate in the way it had been built, something hidden beneath its weathered shell. He remembered the sound when he knocked against it the night before, that hollow echo muffled by something solid within. It was not empty, of that he was certain. Determined, he gathered his tools. The grinder screeched as he set the blade against the surface, showering the air with sparks. The outer layer gave way slowly, reluctantly, as if resisting him. Sweat ran down his brow. His arms trembled with the effort, but he pressed harder, moving the blade inch by inch along the corroded steel. Hours slipped away in this struggle, and still the container refused to surrender easily. It became clear that what he was cutting was only a shell, a decoy of weakness that concealed strength beneath. By midday, he had exposed a patch of metal that looked different from the rest. Unlike the decayed skin of the container, this inner wall was smooth, its sheen still visible despite the years. He paused, catching his breath, staring at the revelation with wide eyes. It was no ordinary shipping container. It was something else entirely, something meant to endure. Working carefully, he continued along the seam, peeling back more of the false layer until his blade scraped across a recessed line. His pulse quickened as he realized what it was. A hatch, circular in shape, bolted tightly in place, the edges sealed with a thick rubber gasket that had hardened over time. It looked like something torn from the design of a submarine or a bunker, a doorway meant to keep air and light out or in. Michael crouched before it, hands trembling as he touched the cold metal. Every part of him screamed that this was no accident. Someone had hidden this hatch behind layers of decay, disguising it within the bones of an ordinary container. Whoever had done it had not wanted it to be found, and yet here it was, before him, waiting. For a long moment he simply sat there, staring at it. The junkyard around him faded into silence as he imagined what might lie beyond. Riches, perhaps, or weapons, or bones. His imagination leapt in every direction, and with each possibility came both dread and wonder. By evening, when the others had left, Michael remained. He could not walk away now, not after coming this far. He fetched a set of wrenches and began working on the bolts. They resisted, corroded into place, groaning in protest as he applied force. His hands slipped more than once, knuckles scraping against the unforgiving surface until they bled. But he kept at it, gritting his teeth, sweat and blood mixing as the sun sank lower in the sky. One by one, the bolts loosened. Each groan of metal sent a shiver down his spine. He imagined the last person who had closed this hatch, sealing it for decades, confident that it would never be opened again. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser breaking into something sacred or forbidden. And yet he could not stop. Finally, with a deep creak, the last bolt surrendered. Michael placed both hands on the wheel at the center of the hatch and began to turn. The motion was stiff, the rubber seal clinging desperately, but slowly the mechanism yielded. As the seal broke, a faint hiss escaped, a rush of stale, dry air spilling into the open. It smelled of dust, rust, and the faint bitterness of time long forgotten. Michael froze, listening to the sound. It was like the exhalation of something long dead, a sigh that carried decades of silence. He shivered, though the air was not cold, and pressed forward, pushing the hatch open with all his strength. It groaned on its hinges, the darkness beyond revealing itself inch by inch, until the opening was wide enough for him to peer inside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, slicing across metallic walls that gleamed faintly under the dust. The space was small, confined, built with precision. It looked less like storage and more like a chamber, constructed to last. His light caught on shapes stacked against the far wall, rectangular outlines heavy and solid, each one carefully placed in rows. They were crates, large and wooden, their corners reinforced with metal brackets, numbers scrawled across their surfaces in faded paint. Michael's breath quickened. He climbed inside, the air dry and stale against his skin, the silence pressing down like a weight. His boots crunched over a thin layer of dust that swirled lazily in the narrow beams of light. Every detail felt deliberate. The sealed walls, the hidden hatch, the carefully stacked crates. Whoever had built this had not meant it to be temporary. They had meant it to endure, unseen, untouched, a secret buried in plain sight. Kneeling beside the nearest crate, he ran his fingers across its rough surface. The wood was dry, brittle at the edges, but still intact. A rusty nail jutted out near the lid, sharp even after so many years. His pulse hammered in his chest as he realized that this was not some accident of discarded junk. It was a vault built inside a coffin of iron, hidden among the refuse of the world. He sat back on his heels, staring into the dim space, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Questions crowded his mind. Who had built this? What had they wanted to keep hidden? Why had they chosen to bury it here, inside a container disguised as worthless scrap? The weight of those questions pressed down on him, But beneath them all was a single, undeniable truth. He had opened something that was never meant to be opened, and whatever lay within those crates would alter the course of his life forever. As Michael climbed back out of the hatch, the night had already swallowed the yard. The air outside felt colder, harsher, alive with the hum of distant traffic. He wiped the sweat from his face with trembling hands, his clothes streaked with rust and grime. He could still feel the stale breath of that hidden chamber clinging to him, still hear the hiss of air escaping as the seal had broken. He knew he could not tell anyone, not Rachel, not James, not a single soul. This was his secret now, his burden to carry. Tomorrow he would return, and he would open the first crate. Whatever waited inside had been locked away for decades, perhaps longer, and now it belonged to him. The thought thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. He left the yard in silence, his steps quick, his eyes darting over his shoulder as if someone might already know what he had done. Behind him in the corner of the junkyard, the container squatted in the shadows, its secret no longer sealed, its darkness waiting for him to return. When Michael returned to the yard the following day, the world outside seemed unchanged, but something inside him had shifted forever. He no longer moved through his morning in the same haze of fatigue. His body was weary, but his mind burned with anticipation that both thrilled and unsettled him. He could not banish the image of the crates stacked in the hidden chamber. They had lingered in his dreams all night, appearing behind his eyelids even when he tried to force them away. He had seen his flashlight beam crossing the wooden planks again and again, and every time he had jolted awake, his heart racing, wondering whether he was about to uncover fortune or horror. The junkyard was loud and chaotic as always, filled with men shouting orders and metal crashing against metal, but for Michael, the noise blurred into nothingness. All he could hear was the pounding of his own blood as he hurried toward the corner, where the container sat like a sentinel over its secrets. He knew he should have been afraid of what he had found, afraid of what it might mean, but curiosity and desperation carried him forward. For a man who had known nothing but struggle, the idea of something extraordinary waiting in the shadows was irresistible. He climbed into the chamber once more, the air inside still dry and stale, heavy with the taste of rust and time. Dust floated in lazy spirals around his boots as he crouched before the nearest crate. His hands shook as he fitted the end of a crowbar beneath the lid and pressed down. At first the nails resisted, groaning against the metal, but with a sharp crack the wood gave way. The sound echoed in the tight space, startling him with its finality. He pried harder, and the lid splintered as it came free. Inside, wrapped in discolored cloth, lay small leather pouches. He lifted one carefully, surprised by its weight, and loosened the drawstring. His breath caught as gold coins spilled into his palm, their tarnished surfaces still gleaming faintly even under the dust. The designs were strange and old, worn smooth at the edges but unmistakably valuable. For a long moment he simply stared, disbelieving, his hand trembling under the weight of fortune. The coins felt cold and solid, too real to be some dream conjured by his weary mind. A thrill of exhilaration rushed through him, but it was quickly followed by a pressure in his chest, a strange heaviness that felt like dread. He tipped more coins into his hand, watching them clink together softly in the silence, then set them down with care, as though afraid they might vanish if he clutched them too tightly. Beneath the pouches lay more treasures, a silver goblet, its ornate stem etched with delicate patterns, a necklace, its chain as fine as a thread, with a gemstone that glowed darkly in the dim light, and a painting wrapped in yellowed fabric, its colors still vibrant despite the years. Michael's excitement grew frantic. He tore into another crate, pulling aside cloth and paper to reveal more wonders. There were stacks of books bound in cracked leather, their spines embossed with faded gold lettering, exuding the faint aroma of ink and dust. There were envelopes bound with twine, stuffed with stamps of rare and intricate designs. One crate held a gilded frame containing a portrait of a stern-faced man, whose eyes seemed to follow him through the gloom. Everywhere he looked, history unfolded at his feet. Yet even as awe filled him, unease tightened around him like invisible hands. These things were not random trinkets. They had been chosen, preserved, sealed away with intention. The crates were too carefully constructed, too deliberately hidden for this to be mere accident. Whoever had hidden them had cared deeply about their contents, had meant for them to remain unseen. He found himself staring at the treasures with a growing sense of intrusion. Each object was not only valuable, but personal, carrying the weight of a life lived long ago. He picked up one of the envelopes from the bottom of a crate. The paper was brittle with age, its edges curled, but the ink was still legible. The handwriting was elegant, the script curling across the page with the practiced hand of someone long gone. An address faintly appeared in faded letters, a name that meant nothing to him but carried the gravity of identity. Michael's throat tightened. These were not just objects. They were fragments of a family's story, relics of a lineage that had been abandoned to rot in darkness. The gold and silver shimmered with promise, but the photographs and letters whispered of lives interrupted, of voices silenced by time. He imagined the hands that had once touched these coins, the eyes that had once stared at these photographs, the hearts that had once written these words. A wave of guilt rose in him, as though he had stumbled into a stranger's house and begun rifling through their memories. Still, he could not stop. For hours he worked feverishly, dragging crates into the light, sorting their contents into little piles around him. Coins glinted on the floor, goblets and jewels caught the thin beams of his flashlight, and letters lay scattered like fallen leaves. His heart soared and sank in equal measure with every new discovery. One moment he felt as though he had been blessed with a miracle, the next as though he had pried open a tomb. By the time exhaustion forced him to stop, he was surrounded by a ring of treasures that shimmered faintly in the gloom. He leaned back against the wall, his body trembling, his chest tight. He had found wealth beyond anything he had imagined, enough to erase every debt, to transform his family's life, to buy freedom from the crushing weight of poverty. And yet he could not silence the voice inside that told him he had also awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed. As he sat there, coins scattered around his boots, the faces in the faded photographs seemed to stare at him with solemn eyes. The letters whispered their stories in the silence, fragments of arguments, betrayals, and losses captured in ink. The treasures at his feet were not just riches, they were burdens, heavy with history and sorrow. Michael rose unsteadily and climbed out of the hatch, dragging a small bundle of coins and documents with him. He felt the weight of them in his hands, not just physical but moral, as if they pressed against his conscience with invisible force. He carried them to his car, hiding them beneath the seat, his heart hammering with paranoia that someone might see. That night at home, he could barely eat. Rachel asked him a question at dinner, something about bills, but he barely heard her. James muttered about homework and disappeared into his room. Michael sat in silence, his thoughts consumed by the images replaying in his mind. The gleam of gold, the trembling handwriting on old letters, the faces of people long dead staring at him from their portraits. Long after his family had gone to bed, he crept into the garage and unwrapped the bundle. Under the dim light of a single bulb, he spread the coins and papers across a workbench. His fingers traced the letters, his eyes scanning the faded words. He could not understand all of them, but he felt their weight nonetheless. They spoke of quarrels between siblings, of debts that could not be paid, of marriages unapproved, of estates lost to disputes. They spoke of sorrow and hope, of lives lived in the shadow of uncertainty. Michael sat there for hours, lost in the voices of the past. He wanted to believe the treasure was his, that by the rules of the auction it now belonged to him. But with every letter he read, every photograph he touched, the certainty unraveled. These were not things to be owned. They were legacies, fragments of humanity sealed away and forgotten, now unearthed by a man desperate for a miracle. When he finally dragged himself back inside, the night was almost over. Rachel stirred as he slipped into bed, murmuring a question he could not answer. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the discovery pressing against his chest. Wealth beyond imagining had fallen into his hands, but it was shackled to ghosts. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. In the silence, he heard the faint clink of coins, the whisper of letters, the gaze of faces staring at him from the dark. The treasure was his, yes, but so was the burden. And deep in his bones, Michael knew this was only the beginning. The nights that followed became longer than Michael had ever known. Sleep abandoned him as if it no longer belonged in his life. He would lie awake in the dim quiet of the bedroom, staring into the dark while Rachel breathed steadily beside him, and James shifted in his room across the hall. His mind replayed the sight of coins spilling into his hands, the shimmer of a silver goblet, the solemn eyes of men and women captured in photographs a century old. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the weight of those treasures pressing down on him, not just as objects but as voices whispering from the past. He tried to carry on at work as though nothing had changed, but his thoughts betrayed him. The clang of steel, the hiss of torches, the heavy machinery all faded into a background hum while his mind returned again and again to the hidden chamber. The piles of gold and silver were burned into his memory. More than once he caught himself staring into the distance, hands idle, until another worker barked at him to pay attention. His boss noticed his distraction too, his shouts sharper than usual, but Michael barely heard them. He was somewhere else, trapped between wonder and guilt. At home, the distance grew clearer. Rachel saw the changes before he admitted them to himself. He returned later than usual, carrying on with vague explanations, claiming he had extra work to do at the yard. She frowned, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but she asked no further questions. James avoided him altogether, retreating deeper into his world of school and friends, too wrapped in his own life to notice how distracted his father had become. Michael felt himself slipping further from them, caught in a private storm he could not share. Night after night he found himself in the garage, the treasures laid out on a bench beneath the weak glow of a lamp. The coins glimmered like tiny suns, their edges worn yet still radiant. The documents stretched across the wood, fragile and yellowed, telling stories of families torn apart by disputes, of fortunes won and lost, of betrayals whispered between lines. He read them obsessively, tracing the handwriting as though it might reveal some hidden answer. The photographs haunted him most. Children with ribbons in their hair, sailors in uniform, stern-faced patriarchs and weary mothers, all of them staring at him through the veil of time. He could not shake the feeling that they were watching, judging, demanding something he did not understand. Fear began to creep into his fascination. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder more often, convinced that someone was watching him. A car parked too long near the yard made his pulse quicken. Strangers loitering on the sidewalk seemed to linger just a moment too long. Once, walking to his car after work, he felt eyes on him and spun around sharply only to find no one there. The paranoia clung to him like a shadow, and he realized he no longer trusted the silence. The night he heard noises outside the garage cemented his dread. He had been hunched over a stack of papers, translating what little he could with the help of old dictionaries, when a rustling reached his ears. The sound was faint, like footsteps in the grass, followed by the soft creak of wood. He froze, switching off the lamp, holding his breath as he listened. The garage fell into complete darkness, but his heart pounded so loudly he thought it might give him away. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, until at last the sound faded. When he opened the door cautiously, the yard outside lay empty, shadows stretching long across the ground. But he could not shake the certainty that someone had been there. From then on, every moment carried the edge of tension. At work, he felt whispers cut short when he entered the break room, though his colleagues likely paid him no more attention than usual. On the street, he thought he saw the same man twice in two different places, a figure lingering on the corner before disappearing into the crowd. His dreams grew darker, filled with faces emerging from shadows, coins spilling like sand through his fingers, no matter how tightly he tried to hold them. And through it all, the moral weight pressed harder. The gold could transform his life, pay every debt, give Rachel the peace she longed for, and James the opportunities he deserved. He could quit the yard, walk away from years of drudgery, breathe for the first time without debt suffocating him. Yet every letter he read, every photograph he touched, reminded him that these treasures had once belonged to others. Families had guarded them, carried them, perhaps even died trying to protect them. To claim them as his own felt like theft of something more profound than wealth. It felt like stealing memory itself. He tried to justify it with the law. The auction had been fair. He had paid, and the container was his. By right, everything inside belonged to him. But the law felt flimsy compared to the eyes staring back at him from faded photographs, compared to the trembling words written by hands long gone. He could not silence the voice that whispered he was a trespasser, an intruder clutching at ghosts. Rachel noticed his restlessness. She asked if something was wrong, her tone sharper than concern, more like accusation. Michael shook his head, offering empty reassurances, but she did not believe him. Their home, already strained by years of disappointment, grew heavier with unspoken tension. He felt himself losing her with every lie of omission, every night spent in the garage instead of at her side. The more time he spent with the treasure, the more it consumed him. He no longer thought of it as a miracle, but as a presence that had taken hold of him. He began to wonder if he had unearthed something cursed. The crates had not been abandoned by accident. They had been hidden with purpose, sealed behind steel and rust, buried in a coffin of iron. Perhaps they had been meant to remain buried forever. Perhaps he had broken a seal that was never meant to be broken. One sleepless night, as dawn crept pale and fragile beneath the garage door, Michael whispered aloud the thought that had haunted him in silence. He had not found freedom, but a prison made of gold. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and though no one else heard them, he felt as though the shadows themselves leaned closer. He sat there with his face in his hands, trembling with the knowledge that he could neither abandon the treasure nor fully claim it without tearing himself apart. The days bled into one another. Work became mechanical, home became distant, and the garage became his world. He lived between stacks of coins and yellowed papers, between the glitter of wealth and the whisper of ghosts. He felt trapped in a web woven long before his time, caught in the threads of other lives, other choices, other histories. The treasure no longer glowed with promise. It glared with accusation. And yet, despite the fear, despite the guilt, he could not let it go. Something in him clung to it with desperate hands, unwilling to release what fate had delivered. The container had given him everything he had ever dreamed of, but it had also given him something far more dangerous, a burden he could neither carry nor cast aside. As he left the garage that morning, eyes red from lack of sleep, the sun rose behind him, casting long shadows that stretched across the street. Michael glanced over his shoulder, convinced for an instant that one of those shadows moved when he did not. He quickened his pace, clutching his jacket tighter. The thought gnawing at him that the past was no longer just behind him, it was following him. The first pale light of morning slipped under the garage door, falling across the scattered coins that still lay where Michael had left them. He sat hunched in his chair, eyes red and unfocused, his hands pressed together as if in prayer. The night had passed in silence, broken only by his ragged breaths and the creak of the old wooden bench beneath him. He had not moved for hours. He was no longer counting the days by his shifts at the yard or the small rhythms of his household. His life was measured now in hours spent staring at the gold, in nights divided by the whisper of papers too fragile to touch without trembling. He had long stopped pretending to himself that this was freedom. The treasure did not liberate him, it bound him. He had dreamed once of a life without debt, of walking without the weight of bills dragging him down, of giving his son opportunities he had never had. But the more he looked at the coins and goblets and paintings, the less they felt like salvation. They were chains, each one clinking softly against his conscience, reminding him that he was only their keeper, never their rightful owner. The paranoia that had haunted him for days grew unbearable. He could no longer step outside without scanning the street. A car idling too long on the corner became a threat. A stranger's eyes meeting his across the yard felt like a warning. He sensed pursuit in every shadow, footsteps in every silence. The memory of that night outside the garage, the rustle in the grass. The faint creak gnawed at him relentlessly. He knew someone had been there, someone who might return. The thought festered until even his dreams were filled with eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip. At home, the strain pulled everything apart. Rachel confronted him at last, her patience broken, her voice sharp as she demanded to know what was happening. He had no answer she could believe. He muttered excuses, claimed he was tired, overworked, distracted, but his hollow words only widened the distance. She withdrew further, her gaze colder, Her presence in the house little more than silence and shadows. James barely spoke to him at all. The boy had always looked at him with a mixture of hope and disappointment, but now there was only distance, as though his father no longer existed. Michael felt himself losing them both, slipping from their lives even as he clung to the very thing that had driven the wedge deeper. He returned again and again to the documents, searching for meaning, for a way to reconcile the burden he had unearthed. Among the brittle pages he found one that unsettled him more than all the rest. It was a draft of a will, incomplete and unsigned, but the words leapt out at him as though written for his eyes alone. If no rightful heir may be found, let it remain in trust, not to be squandered. He read the sentence over and over until the ink blurred before him. The message cut deeper than any law or contract. It was not wealth meant to be claimed, but to be preserved. Not for greed, but for remembrance. The words echoed in his mind long after he folded the paper away. They followed him into his sleep, whispered to him in the silence of dawn. Was this what fate had asked of him not to take, but to guard? He tried to convince himself that he had been chosen by chance, that destiny had placed this burden in his hands. But the doubt was relentless. Keeping the treasure for himself would betray the intent of those who had hidden it. Giving it away would betray his own family, who needed him to be more than a man crushed beneath bills and broken promises. He wrestled with this torment until his nerves frayed. Days blurred into weeks, each one spent in the same restless cycle. At the yard he moved through his tasks mechanically, his hands cutting and stacking, while his thoughts spiraled elsewhere. At home he avoided Rachel's gaze, unable to meet the unspoken questions in her eyes. In the garage he hovered between temptation and guilt, staring at the glitter of coins that promised so much, yet seemed to burn when he reached for them. One evening, when the weight became unbearable, he began to act. He sat at the bench with trembling hands and divided the treasure into two piles. Half he set aside for himself, to give his family the life they deserved. Half he separated carefully, stacking coins and placing goblets and documents in neat bundles. This portion, he told himself, would remain untouched, preserved in case heirs appeared, or if one day it needed to be returned. It was not perfect justice, but it was balance. It was the only way he could carry the burden without breaking. The act drained him, yet it also brought a flicker of relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt a measure of clarity. He was not free, but he was no longer paralyzed. He had made a choice, and the choice gave him strength. He would keep enough to secure his family's future, but he would not desecrate the past entirely. The ghost could not accuse him of greed if he honored their memory with restraint. Or so he told himself, even as doubt lingered like smoke in his chest. Over the following months, Michael's life shifted quietly. He paid off debts without fanfare, careful not to draw attention. He repaired the apartment, fixed the peeling paint, and bought James new clothes that fit properly. Rachel noticed the change, though he never explained the source. She saw only that the man who had once been worn thin by hopelessness now carried himself with firmer steps. Their home grew lighter, the air less heavy, though silence still lingered in the corners. And yet, even as the surface of his life smoothed, the shadows remained. At night he returned to the garage, sitting before the divided piles, staring at them in silence. The coins still glimmered, the letters still whispered, the faces in the photographs still stared with solemn eyes. He could not free himself from them. The compromise had lifted part of the weight, but it had not severed the bond. The treasure was bound to him, and he to it, in a chain that could not be broken. Sometimes he imagined the future, James grown, Rachel older, himself walking away from the yard forever. A life without struggle, without humiliation. But always in the vision, he saw the treasure still there, waiting in the shadows, a reminder that his fortune was built on bones and silence. The container had given him more than wealth. It had given him a test, a trial that would shape the rest of his life. One night, sitting alone as the wind rattled the walls, he realized that the story was no longer about what he had found, but about what it had made of him. He was no longer just a man bent by poverty. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of ghosts, a prisoner of gold. His destiny had changed the moment he broke the seal, and there was no turning back. The container had once squatted in the junkyard like a coffin, rusted and forgotten. Now its contents lived inside him, a weight that would never leave. Whatever future awaited, whether brighter or darker, Michael Harris knew one truth with absolute certainty. The price of discovery was not measured in coins or jewels, but in the soul of the man who carried them. Don't miss the next unbelievable story. Hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you're the first to watch. Want more shocking discoveries? Click here to dive into the next video and uncover secrets you won't believe exist. And if this story left you speechless, share it with your friends. They'll never guess what's hidden inside.